Have you ever wondered what the world was like back in the 70s and 80s? In some ways, it was quite different to what you would consider normal today, and you should consider yourself lucky to be around in this day and age. Today, we'll take you through some of the weirdest things that were actually illegal back in the day. Public displays of affection. Some people may be shocked, but in the 70s and 80s, PDA was illegal in many countries around the world. Places like the Middle East, Sudan, Iran, and Singapore. But when you realize that even Western countries like the UK and USA had public decency and obscenity laws, you realize just how different the world actually was. Home-brewed beer. Brewing your own beer at home has been highly regulated around the world for centuries, but these days it's more relaxed. You may be stunned to know that until 1978, it was a crime in the United States. We have Jimmy Carter to thank for getting rid of that archaic law. Slurping soup in public. In some parts of Asia, slurping soup is encouraged as a sign you're enjoying your meal, but not so much in the West. In New Jersey, there's a long-standing myth it was illegal to slurp. However, it's just poor manners, and you're never in danger of going to jail. Unauthorized display of eccentric costumes. Wearing overtly eccentric costumes in some states was seen as provocative back in the day, and it came down to the persecution of LGBT people. States like New York, Louisiana, Texas, and California targeted people of alternate lifestyles deep into the 20th century. Having a couch on your porch. It may sound bizarre, but it's actually practical. In places like Boulder, Colorado, and Columbia, Missouri, lawmakers banned upholstered furniture on porches due to fire risk. Many of these localized bans came down to student parties, but were never actually enforced in state legislation. Playing pinball if under 18. Stemming from anti-gambling laws in places like LA, New York, and Chicago, they all banned minors from playing pinball. It was thought that much like rock and roll, it was morally wrong, and also that some pinball outlets were controlled by the mob. Underground zine distribution. Back in the day, some punk and counterculture and LGBTQ+ zines were targeted under local laws. States had their own guidelines as what was considered obscene, and in some cases, the Postal Service even confiscated bootleg and explicit zines through the mail. Unauthorized whistling in quiet zones. While many places have over the years had local ordinances against whistling, there have been a few notable exceptions. Boston, Salem, New York, and Alabama have all had nuisance laws banning the innocuous pastime of whistling throughout the years. Hanging obstructions from the rearview mirror. Many states banned objects hanging from the rear view, and it comes down to safety. Anything that may block the driver's view or distract someone could be used as an excuse to pull someone over and issue a ticket. Places like Florida, Texas, Michigan, and more have all made this practically illegal back in the day. So think carefully the next time you decide to hang anything from your rearview mirror. Excessive public smiling. If you happen to find yourself in a good mood back in the day, you could find yourself attracting unwanted attention. While it was never illegal, places like New York City, Salt Lake City, and Chicago all had public decorum laws at one point or another, meaning an officer could be prone to arresting someone acting suspiciously, which could include too much smiling. Driving a black car on Sundays. There's a popular tale that driving a black car in Denver on a Sunday could land you in trouble with the law in the 70s and 80s, but it's actually a myth. It was thought that driving a black car could have interfered with the holiness of the day, and while it may have existed under blue laws in the early 20th century, it was never enforced. Public protests and demonstrations. This one was heavily regulated in the 70s and 80s due to public unrest after the outbreak of the Vietnam War. While the First Amendment protected people's right to peaceful demonstration, many states were wary of civil rights, anti-nuclear, and anti-war movements and sought more control by tightly managing public demonstrations. Unauthorized laughing in formal settings. While there's very little evidence of people getting into trouble for laughing, it's almost certainly not something you'd want to do in an official courtroom. Laughing while the judge is in full flow would result in a contempt of court charge, which would come with a serious reprimand. Jumping from buildings. Somewhat obviously, jumping from a building could land you in hot water back in the day. There's the obvious safety issues, but the rise in popularity of base jumping meant it was becoming difficult to enforce. States would hit you with trespassing and reckless endangerment charges, assuming you survived the jump. Connecting to the internet without authorization. Connecting to the internet in the 70s and 80s would have been difficult. There was no free Wi-Fi in every place, and at that time most networks belonged to government outfits, so you would have been in violation of usage policies. By the 1980s, hacking laws were beginning to take shape and were seen to be a very serious crime. Prohibited use of novelty hats in public. While there's no widely enforced law regarding novelty hats, you wouldn't want to turn up to court in a silly one. Wearing a novelty hat in other places like religious buildings, schools, and private establishments could land you in hot water, and one of the best uses of this was the anti-mask law, which targeted outlaw groups like the KKK. Pirate radio broadcasts. The Communications Act of 1934 allowed authorities to regularly locate and shut down pirate radio stations, and they did in droves. One infamous case was Rebel Radio. Based in California in the 70s, they were continually raided by the FCC. The coming of the internet made it harder to track the freedom fighters down. Boombox blasting. As the 70s rolled around, blasting a boombox became a problem in many built-up areas. Cities like New York City, Miami, Chicago, all of which had very strong music scenes, became the target of local government crackdowns. And they introduced quiet zones in a bid to curb loud music in public areas. Illegal carrying of random items in your back pocket. There's an urban myth that claims carrying an ice cream cone in your back pocket to combat horse theft became illegal in Alabama in the 70s, but it's almost certainly a myth. Carrying articles that could be considered weapons is definitely going to lead to a fine and arrest in most states throughout the U.S., so before you put something strange in your back pocket, make sure to think about it first. Bootlegged vinyl record pressings. The Sound Recording Act of 1971 made unauthorized duplication of sound recording illegal and gave artists and labels more protection from criminals. Bootleg operations in every state in the country were raided throughout the 70s and 80s, unearthing a vast conspiracy of illegal copyrighted material, leading to millions of dollars worth of confiscated recordings. Spitting on the sidewalk. In many states, spitting on the sidewalk was and still is illegal due to public health concerns. The law first came into practice to curb the rise of tuberculosis in the early 20th century, and while it isn't strictly enforced these days, it's technically still in effect. Anyone who spent more than 5 minutes in New York City probably pines for strict enforcement. Carrying ice cream cones in your back pocket. This law reportedly came into effect to stop people luring horses away from their rightful owners back in the day, but it's much likely that it's an urban legend. The idea was the thief could coax the horse away, thus bypassing theft laws, as they technically weren't stealing it. Unauthorized use of portable radios on restricted frequencies. The Communications Act of 1934 meant that using restricted frequencies was illegal. This basically was made to combat people listening in on official channels like the police, aviation, and military. And it makes you wonder why those frequencies were so easy to tune in to begin with. Frowning at police officers. This one was never explicitly illegal, and it's basically a case of reading the room. If you found yourself in a situation facing off with an officer, it's not going to help your case to frown. The so-called manners law in the Jim Crow era of the South would mean that frowning at police could land you in hot water, especially if that officer was white and you were not. Wearing camouflage in urban areas. While never illegal in the United States, there are countries where the practice could land you in jail. The Philippines, Barbados, apartheid-era South Africa, and Myanmar have all had at one time or another restricted civilian use of military clothing due to affiliation with rebel causes. Profane language in public. In many places of the United States during the 70s and 80s, you could get into serious trouble for using foul language in public. In one well-publicized case, the court ruled that wearing a jacket with the F word on it was protected under free speech. As you can imagine, using profane language in public in the South was policed a little bit more often. Unlicensed pinball machines. In many states from World War II to the mid-70s, pinball was flat-out banned. They had laws in place restricting the use of machines as they were seen as a form of gambling, and if you happened to own one in the wrong state, you could end up facing jail time. Painting polka dots on the American flag. You may not be surprised to learn that defacing the stars and stripes in any way is punishable by the 1968 federal flag desecration law, but some states take it even further and have written into local law as well. In the 70s, if you dared desecrate the flag in public, you could face legal action, but after 1989, your right to burn the flag in protest is protected under freedom of speech. Illegal hanging of decorations on public property. Hanging decorations on public property was and still is illegal in many states. It's argued that hanging them could impact safety by creating a hazard. There's vandalism and property damage considerations, as well as permit requirements. New York, D.C., and San Francisco in the 70s were a particular case in point, as anti-war demonstrations were at their peak. Unauthorized outdoor film screenings. Showing a film without a permit was illegal in the 70s and 80s for a myriad of reasons like copyright infringement, lack of permit, and public safety concern. Companies like Warner Brothers were so confused by the issue that pop-up shows in New York and California were shut down mid-screening and organizers fined. Illegal bicycle bell ringing in pedestrian zones. If you happen to ring your bicycle bell in a pedestrian zone in New York City in the 70s, you could have potentially been sent to jail. A 1975 cyclist was fined for excessive noise for overusing his bell in a pedestrianized area, and of course, it was the sort of thing that was rarely enforced. Feeding pigeons. Think back to when you were a child and you undoubtedly spent afternoons feeding birds. If that happened to be in a certain public New York State park in the 70s, chances are you were breaking the law. Feeding encouraged rapid breeding, which meant that overpopulation in urban areas was a real problem. Excessive public dancing without a permit. In some states throughout the 70s, bars were fined for allowing customers to dance without a cabaret license. New York was a particular hotspot, but it wasn't only happening in the States. Places like London and even Japan were known to enforce this particularly archaic law. Banned counterculture films. Many counterculture films with themes of rebellion, sex, drug use, violence, and anti-establishment were limited during the 70s. A Clockwork Orange, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Monty Python's Life of Brian were all deemed explicit, and authorities in many states decided their poor innocent public couldn't handle the content and promptly banned them. Illegal use of laser light shows. Back in the day, FAA and FDA regulations dictated that laser light shows were a public safety risk. Around airports, authorities were very strict, and DJs as well as event organizers were often fined. Personal use was usually deemed okay, but there have been cases where individuals have been prosecuted after pointing them at aircrafts. Using silly string in public. Some states banned the use of silly string due to it being classified as a public nuisance. Safety hazards as well as cleanup costs were also a determining factor. Cities and states enforced the laws through the 70s and 80s, and even today it's still banned on Halloween in Los Angeles, with those who choose to violate the law facing a $1,000 fine. Installing bathtubs without legs. It may seem like a weird one, but it's actually true that there were laws against this in the 19th and 20th centuries. Sanitation and drainage concerns meant that in certain places, bathtubs were required to have legs, but before you head off to check, take a breath and relax, because no one was ever prosecuted for this heinous crime. Improper display of national symbols. It may not surprise you to learn that American lawmakers take their national symbols quite seriously. The U.S. Flag Code actually provides guidelines for handling the U.S. flag, and you can't be prosecuted for misuse, but in certain communities you may certainly face backlash for using the flag in a disparaging manner. Barking dogs after a certain hour. This one may just resonate with everyone. In the States, hundreds of local laws dictate that barking dogs can incur a fine for their owner. In New York City, a 1972 law made it illegal for a dog to bark for more than 10 minutes, while Chicago settled for a 15-minute sting before fining the owner. Illegal public yodeling. While yodeling itself has never been outlawed, it falls under the noise disturbance law. Technically, if it happened to be part of a street performance or something else which had not been permitted, the yodeler could find themselves in trouble with the long arm of the law. Unauthorized use of neon or flashy clothing in public. Some states limited the wearing of flashing clothing for different reasons. In New York City, it discouraged disco and funk music fans, but in Vegas, it was part of many casino policies. If you find yourself in Tennessee wearing the wrong thing in the 70s, you could have been mistaken for a hippie, which wouldn't have ended well for you. Wearing roller skates in public restrooms. While it was never technically illegal, it definitely would have been deemed a liability and probably fallen under the nuisance and public safety laws. California, New York, and Texas all had strict nuisance laws, so some people certainly would have gotten into trouble, but probably not jail. Illegal mask wearing. Mask wearing has been banned at various times over history, largely to stop people from hiding their identity. Many southern states had anti-mask laws that aimed at curtailing the activity of the Klan, but authorities in D.C. and California cracked down on mass demonstrators during the Vietnam War. Wearing hot pants in public parks. Hot pants were a huge fashion trend in the 70s and 80s, but faced strong backlash from sections of society. Modesty and decency laws in places like Texas, Florida, and Louisiana meant that wearing hot pants in a public place was heavily restricted. Some people even faced criminal prosecution. Singing in a swimsuit in public. While it may sound silly, some places are more conservative than others. In places like Florida, they had laws against singing and dancing in revealing attire, while New Jersey and Kentucky have their own interpretations of noise laws. Walking a dog without a diaper. While the idea of the dog diaper may have been an embellishment of pet waste laws, it's certainly correct that some states have strict no-mess policies. D.C., San Francisco, and New York City have all been known to require owners to clean up after their pets. New York City passed the Pooper Scooper law in 1978, when some residents began dressing their dogs in diapers to avoid a fine. Unauthorized graffiti on public buildings. Back in the 1970s, New York City became the global epicenter of graffiti, with renowned artists practicing there. However, more conservative sections of society saw it as a ruinous counterculture, with Los Angeles, Chicago, and Philadelphia scrambling to ban the practice. Illegal blowing of bubblegum bubbles. This one's never technically been illegal in the States, but if you happen to be in Singapore, you'll have experienced strict anti-bubblegum laws. Many schools in the States have banned bubblegum in the 70s and 80s, but the harshest punishment you could expect would be an hour's worth of detention. Flirting using flags. This one was never illegal, but there have been some instances of flag waving being used to convey certain messages in some societies. During the early 20th century, Chicago had laws against flirtatious glances, but none of them included the use of flags. Donkeys in bathtubs. While it's certainly a strange one, it was also illegal in Kingman, Arizona. One resident of the town had taken to allowing his donkey to sleep in a tub on his property, and during a flash flood, it was once washed away. As the story goes, townspeople spent considerable time and resources trying to rescue it, which was very good of them. Thanks for dropping by to see 50 of the weirdest things that were illegal in the 70s and 80s. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another great video in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.